What is art without the muse? Many of Western art's most famous works are depictions of women. But who were these women? Do they have their own stories to share with the world? Hello and welcome to ArtMuse, a podcast that aims to reshape the ways in which we interpret well-known works of art by paying dues to the women whose images have been immortalized, but whose names and stories have been wrongfully overlooked. While these women's faces are familiar to viewers around the world, their identities have been largely forgotten. Together, we will appreciate these works of art from a new perspective, through the eyes of the women whose image stares back at us. Is the muse in actuality just as, if not more important than the artists themselves? And I'm your host, Grace Anna. Welcome to part 2 of our 2-part episode on the Marchesa Luisa Casati. In part 1, we explored Luisa's privileged beginnings, her intense shyness and love for the arts, her close relationship with her mother, and the tragic loss of both of her parents at the mere age of 15, making her an orphan as well as the richest heiress in all of Italy. We then explored her marriage to Camillo Casati, affair with the acclaimed writer Gabriele D'Annunzio, the development of her performative persona and dramatic look, and her discovery of the magical city of Venice. We left things off at the peak of Luisa's social life in Venice, throwing the grandest parties the city, and perhaps all of Europe, had ever seen. But Luisa's eccentric life would have devastating consequences for her family, and would eventually alienate her from her sister, daughter, and husband. Luisa had remained close to her sister Francesca even through her early years as an eccentric socialite. Her sister, the only other person in the world who understood the pain of losing both their parents, accepted Luisa's changed persona and appearance with open arms. She was happy to see her sister finally coming out of her own shell, and therefore overlooked Luisa's more concerning behavior. But when Francesca contracted meningitis and was left disfigured, Luisa stopped inviting her to parties, too embarrassed for Francesca to be seen with her in public. We can only imagine how stung Francesca must have felt by Luisa's superficiality. When her sister needed her most, Luisa turned her back on her. Francesca would soon after die in 1919 from the Spanish flu at the age of 39. Luisa was also too absorbed in her social life to look after her daughter Cristina. As soon as she was old enough, Luisa sent Cristina to a boarding school in France. Cristina didn't even visit Luisa on holidays, spending them with Francesca instead. Tired of Luisa's antics, Camillo made a motion to legally separate in 1914. Somewhat surprisingly, the then 13-year-old Cristina chose Luisa as her sole guardian. Luisa would keep her in the French boarding school for the next few years, until Cristina was accepted into Oxford University. As Cristina grew, she began to resemble her mother more and more in looks and personality. She shared her mother's large emerald eyes, as well as her love for snakes, and even kept a small boa constrictor in her dorm room. Luisa would on occasion visit her at Oxford University, equally in it to attend college parties as she was to see her daughter. But Luisa was far more concerned with building her own self-image than she was with her family. She continued to commission portraits of herself across the mediums from prominent artists of her day. One of the most notable of these portraits was by the American-born sculptor Jacob Epstein. Luisa met Epstein at a lunch in 1918, and soon after commissioned her portrait from him. His bust of Luisa was not only considered one of the best works amongst Luisa's growing portfolio of portraits, but is today appreciated as Epstein's greatest masterpiece. In Epstein's bust, we see an intense Luisa, staring us down with blazing eyes. Her eyebrows, lips, and jaw are clenched, as if she's dissatisfied by our presence and is about to tell us off. Her hair, fashioned in her signature blunt bangs and bob cut, coils from her head like little snakes. Like Medusa, here Luisa is omnipotent, a mystical sorceress with a dangerous wrath and unafraid to use it. Jacob Epstein would later reminisce on the unforgettable experience of sculpting Luisa. As Epstein recalled, "That winter I had many candles brought in. They formed a circle round my weird sitter, with the fire in the grate piled high to give more light. The tireless Marchesa, with her overly large blood-veined eyes, sat with a basilisk stare. The Medusa-like mask was finished the next day. It captured the full ferocity of her concentration and expressed, as few portraits would, the strange force of her character." It was also around this time that Luisa was first introduced to the Welsh painter Augustus John, who would not only paint her portrait, but become one of Luisa's few lifelong friends. Known equally for his success as a portraitist, as he was for his provocative behavior and promiscuity, John and Luisa felt like they were cut from the same cloth. John first observed Luisa at a party, and was instantly drawn to her bizarre behavior. As he later described of their first meeting, "A lady of unusual distinction entered. Her bearing, personality, and peculiar elegance seemed to throw the rest of the company into the shade. She moved around the ballroom with supreme ease, while looking about her with an expression of slightly malicious amusement." John and Luisa almost immediately hit it off. John had immense respect for Luisa's unrestrained way of life and capacity to constantly reinvent herself. Luisa loved John's prickly sense of humor and fun-filled personality. The two embarked on a short but intense affair. But as with most of Luisa's flings, their romantic connection soon faded. Luisa was far more interested in her own self-mythologizing than her relationships with men. As a friend of John's wrote, "They flung themselves towards each other, but the romance, a brilliantly casual performance, seemed sadly under-rehearsed. Sex was not the real attraction between them. Casati took other people's admiration for granted, using it as an orchestration to her life, a perpetual chorus singing invisibly while she stood on stage alone. Otherwise, love affairs threatened to interfere with her passionate self-love. As an exhibitionist, she needed partners only for her audience." Though their affair did not last, Luisa and John would remain close friends for the rest of Luisa's life. Also lasting was John's masterful portrait of Luisa. Painted in 1919, Luisa is posed after the Mona Lisa, standing at a 3/4 angle with her hands clasped against a blue mountainous background. Here, her extreme look is more apparent, her hair an almost clownish red, her eyes coated with black kohl, and her blush caked on across her cheeks. Once again, Luisa confronts the viewer directly, but in John's portrait there seems to be a hint of sadness within the wells of her deep dark eyes. Standing in her white nightgown, we get a rare glimpse of Luisa's grief, hidden behind her performative mask. Here she is both raw and vulnerable, no longer a mythological goddess, but instead, unabashedly human. Luisa's portrait received overwhelmingly positive reviews. As one critic of the time wrote, "I consider it to be an outstanding masterpiece. It is no exaggeration to say this will live forever," which is true of very few pictures of modern times. You can safely place it for comparison alongside the great Velázquez, Giorgione, or even Titian. And many years later, the famous beat poet Jack Kerouac would happen upon the painting. He was so inspired by Luisa's striking image that he not only bought a reproduction of the work, but wrote the following poem. Marchesa Casati is a living doll, pinned on my fresco Skid Row wall. Her eyes are vast, her skin is shiny, blue veins and wild red hair, shoulders sweet and tiny. Love her, sings the sea, bluely, moaning, in the Augustus John background. That same year, Luisa also spent time on the island of Capri, a then bohemian community of artists, poets, and writers. Though a creative herself, Luisa stuck out like a sore thumb. Despite the warm beach weather, Luisa insisted on dressing exclusively in long black gowns and heavy makeup. As the writer Roger Perfit wrote of meeting Luisa in Capri, the Marchesa wore an astrologer's hat. Her makeup, melting in the heat, ran in streams down to her dusty shoes. She carried a crystal ball in her hands to cool them. Her witchy appearance certainly turned heads, even amongst Europe's most forward-thinking eccentrics. She surely caught the attention of Romaine Brooks, a shy and withdrawn American-born painter who had relocated to Capri many years prior. And it seems that Luisa was equally intrigued by Brooks as well. In fact, there's some indication that Luisa became infatuated with Brooks, coming on to her on a number of occasions. Brooks, who was open about her relationships with women, repeatedly turned Luisa down. According to Brooks, her refusals to engage with Luisa sexually became more and more adamant, as Luisa's advances became more and more forceful. Though Brooks is the only woman we know of that Luisa expressed interest in, it does beg the question of her own sexuality. Between her indifference to her marriage, as well as quickly losing interest in her lovers, one does wonder if Luisa's sexual preference leaned towards women. Despite turning down her sexual advances, Brooks was enchanted by Luisa's otherworldly look and bizarre personality. When Luisa asked her to paint her portrait, Brooks happily agreed. Brooks's portrait of Luisa is one of the eeriest and grotesque portraits of her in all of Luisa's repertoire. Painted in 1920, Brooks depicts Luisa in the nude, leaning against a wall. Her body is partially wrapped by a long black cape, making her look like a sorceress of black magic. As her arm stretches out to reach the wall, her cape hangs down, morphing Luisa into a bat-like creature. Her fiery red hair spouts out of her head like flames, and her glaring stare is fierce enough to burn you. Her face, obscured in shadow, looks sunken and sickly, as if her skin is beginning to yellow. As Judith Mackrell beautifully described, the dark shadows around her eyes, the clawing tension of her curled fingers, and the wing-like furl of her cloak suggested the image of a predatory fury, half woman, half bird of prey. Though far from a flattering portrait, Luisa was surprisingly thrilled with the outcome. As Brooks later remembered of Luisa's initial response, "In place of feet, I made it look like claws. I thought she would have screamed, but she said, 'You are a genius.'" But none loved the work more than Brooks herself. Despite Luisa's protests, Brooks refused to ever sell Luisa her portrait. Instead, she kept Luisa's portrait with her for the rest of her life. When she died over 50 years later, the portrait was found rolled up beneath her bed. Though she had turned down her many advances, Romaine Brooks was evidently under Luisa's spell for the rest of her life. But arguably Luisa's greatest portraits were yet to come. By the 1920s, wealthy patrons began to prefer photographic portraits over paintings. Though photographed once by Adolphe de Meyer, Luisa was hoping to build her collection of photographs of herself. But always detesting the norm, she wanted to find a photographer who would capture her in experimental and newfound ways. Luisa met the photographer Man Ray in 1922 in Paris. As Man Ray himself later remembered, "I received a visit from a tall, imposing woman in black with enormous eyes, emphasized with black makeup. She wore a high headdress in black lace and bent her head slightly as she came through the door, as if it were too low for her. Introducing herself as Marchesa Casati, she expressed the wish to be photographed. Never having seen such an unusual woman, Man Ray quickly accepted Luisa's proposal. Luisa invited Man Ray to her hotel suite at the Ritz to capture her image. She posed herself in various positions, surrounded by her collection of curiosities, like crystal balls and spellbooks. She refused to sit still, moving around restlessly from different corners of the room and changing her pose almost manically. An exasperated Man Ray helplessly tried to capture Luisa in one position, later remarking, "It was as if I was doing a movie of her." To make matters worse, in the middle of their photo shoot, one of Man Ray's camera lights blew out. Having to resort to using the main lighting in the hotel room, it was all the more important for Luisa to remain still, or the images would become unfocused. When Man Ray developed the film, he was not at all surprised to find that the negatives were all blurry. Defeated, he considered the entire photo shoot a failure. But when Luisa saw the test prints, she broke out in a huge smile. She turned to the stunned photographer and proclaimed, "You have portrayed my soul." Man Ray's photographs of Luisa are otherworldly and surreal. What Man Ray may have written off as a series of failures were actually what made the photographs so unforgettable. The photographs' blurry exposure, bizarre staging, and manic-eyed subject have a nightmarish quality. In one, Luisa peers through a glass vitrine of flowers, her bloodshot eyes and dark circles caught within the vitrine's frame. Her hair, tousled and unmade, juts out from the top of the vitrine, as if it's being electrified. In her hand, she holds a large crystal ball, her fingers curling around it like serpents. If one looks close enough, Man Ray can be seen in the crystal ball's reflection. In another, Luisa is captured head-on, with thick black makeup and a wide-eyed stare. The photograph is so out of focus that it looks as if Luisa has multiple sets of eyes. Caught mid-motion, the photograph appears to still be moving, bursting with emotion and life. As Man Ray once described, "The image has 3 pairs of eyes. It might have passed for a surrealist version of the Medusa. She was enchanted with this one, said I had portrayed her soul, and ordered dozens of prints." Man Ray's images of Luisa were such a success that they launched his career, and eventually led him to working with fashion magazines like Vogue. They are today considered some of his greatest masterpieces. We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers. Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in. In 1922, Luisa decided she wanted to find a permanent home in Paris. Paris was quickly becoming the creative center of the world, and she loved how freely she could move within its social circles. She decided to purchase the Palais Rose, a large estate with an entirely pink marble facade in the suburbs of Paris. The Palais Rose was previously owned by the poet and eccentric Robert de Montesquieu, who had passed away the year prior. Luisa loved that de Montesquieu had once walked its halls, and sought to honor his outlandish spirit by designing the villa's interior in equally outrageous fashion. Here at the Palais Rose, Luisa implemented her signature black and white color scheme. Though she scaled back her zoo-worthy collection of animals, She did bring with her cheetahs, parrots, cobras, and her favorite boa constrictor, who had its own crystal case. She even had a taxidermy black panther, fitted with a clockwork device that caused its head and tail to move, and eyes to light up. Luisa placed the stuffed panther by the front door to, in her own words, surprise guests and disconcert burglars. We can only imagine the shock visitors felt as they walked through her front door to be greeted by her mechanical panther. She would also continue to turn heads with her outfits. That same year, Luisa wore her most iconic dress to date, one that deserves a place in history. Luisa was close friends with the well-known Russian costume designer Leon Bakst. By the 1920s, he had already designed over 40 custom dresses for her, as well as all of her waiters' and gondoliers' uniforms. But in 1922, Bakst designed a dress for Luisa that made all the others pale in comparison. The dress was meant to turn Luisa into Saint Sebastian, the martyr saint who by divine intervention could not be killed by arrows. Decorated with hundreds of stars, each star was fitted with an actual light bulb that would ignite the dress into a glittering nightscape. As the photographer Cecil Beaton remembered, Casati decided to appear as an electrically equipped Saint Sebastian. She was to wear armor pierced with hundreds of arrows, each studded with glittering stars that were to light up when the Marchesa appeared. On the morning of the ball, she arrived, bringing a fleet of servants, an electrician, and stoves for boiling water to make cups of tea or coffee while the elaborate preparations for her appearance were in progress. At last, the Marchesa was pulled into tights, and the armor was fixed on her with a padlock. But at the moment of being plugged in, a disaster took place. The costume was short-circuited, and instead of being lit up with 1,000 stars, the Marchesa suffered an electrical shock that sent her into a backward somersault. She did not recover in time to appear at the party, leaving a note that simply stated, "Mille regret." Luisa's electrical dress was arguably the greatest fashion faux pas to ever exist. Despite her new pink marble palace and dresses extravagant enough to cause electrical shock, Luisa's efforts were slowly beginning to fall on deaf ears. By the time Luisa reached her 40s, popular tastes changed, and her antics fell further and further out of style. Her signature look, once alluring, became unsettling and unattractive. Her red hair turned clownish, her pale skin turned sickly, and her dilated eyes turned manic. Her once jaw-dropping outfits were now equally out of place, provoking judgment rather than awe. As the photographer Baron Adolf de Meyer lamented, eccentricity is the most unfashionable thing a woman could indulge in nowadays. The more Luisa tried to keep up appearances, the more desperate she seemed to those around her. Feeling the sting of defeat, Luisa kept mostly to herself at the Palais Rose. The few trusted friends she did invite over often bailed due to how far the Palais Rose was from Paris. Once surrounded by artists and eccentrics, Luisa found herself more and more alone. To pass the time, she spent her days horse racing around the countryside, or speed driving in her yellow Rolls-Royce. She delved deeper and deeper into her practice of dark magic and the occult. Though isolated, she at least had the company of her over 100 different portraits of herself that she kept in her own private collection. As historian Scot Ryersson wrote, as Luisa wandered among these multiple images of herself, lost in her palace of dreams, it was all too easy for her to ignore the difficult realities of the outside world. And it was also all too easy for her to slip into the beguiling embrace of drink and drugs. It's true that Luisa turned more and more to drugs like opium to soothe the pain of her social downfall. Under the effects of opium, Luisa could escape her grief and enter a dreamlike state, where the struggles of her new reality did not exist. On especially lonely days, Luisa mixed opium with absinthe, a dangerous concoction, especially for someone as frail as Luisa. But Luisa would take whatever was needed to numb the reality that her once omnipotent power was diminishing. In her prime, she was arguably the most influential woman in all of Europe. Now, Luisa spent most of her days completely alone. And her emotional troubles were overshadowed by her financial ones. By 1923, Luisa was forced to face the grim reality that she had squandered the majority of her inheritance. She now barely had enough funds to keep up with her daily expenses. That December, under the advice of her accountant, Luisa sold her holdings in her father's cotton mill, as well as her parents' many properties. She also arranged to sell her Roman villa, having to say goodbye to the first home she designed according to her own unique vision. But the most devastating decision would come in 1924, when Luisa was forced to sell her beloved Venetian palazzo. At first, Luisa petitioned that the Palazzo dei Leoni become a national monument, but to no avail. Luisa would have to part with the special palazzo of her creation, a place that once had peacocks and cheetahs roaming freely on its grounds, a place where the grandest parties the world had ever seen took place, a place where anything felt possible, a place where Luisa shined as brightly as the sun. How did Luisa feel to say goodbye to her Venetian wonderland and all the grand memories it held? To have to leave the city of her dreams, her life there, now as ephemeral as the reflections on the Grand Canal itself. Did she feel an overwhelming sense of defeat? Or did she hold her head high as she took her last gondola ride out? Luisa would never return to the wondrous city of Venice again. The same year of 1924 would continue to bring personal hardships. Though legally separated for many years, Camillo filed for an official divorce. It's likely that Luisa's financial hardships were the final straw for the overly patient Camillo. Wanting to protect himself from Luisa's reckless spending, Camillo knew his best course of action was divorce. Luisa, who was in Budapest on holiday when she was served the paperwork, was left shocked. Ultimately, Luisa accepted the terms of the divorce settlement. Keeping their finances separate, Luisa was able to keep her title of Marchesa, as well as his last name. Some historians believe that their divorce was the first Roman Catholic divorce in all of Italy. Over the next many years, Luisa became increasingly lonely. Desperate for company, she planned elaborate parties at the Palais Rose and invited as many people as she could. But the few who actually attended came mainly out of pity or sick curiosity. Her behavior at these parties became more and more crazed. One shocked guest recalled Luisa running through her gardens naked while chanting, "I am the truth." As her party guests dwindled, so did her friends. The social circles she once thrived within began to die out, quite literally. By the mid-1920s, her favorite designer, Leon Bakst, passed away. Her favorite guest, Nijinsky, was committed to an institution, and she even found one of her groundkeepers dead in her gardens. She eventually stopped hosting parties altogether. Resigning to her grim reality, Luisa told a reporter at the time, "To be different is to be alone. I don't like what is average, so I am alone." All the while, her financial situation was only worsening. The sale of her family's assets, as well as her Roman and Venetian homes, were only temporary relief. Soon her debts were once again piling. Her accountant desperately pleaded with her to stop spending money, as her funds had reached an all-time low. To fend off creditors, Luisa began handing over expensive jewelry, and because she had little cash, she traded diamond bracelets for taxi rides and groceries. By 1931, Luisa had accumulated a debt of over $25 million. She was soon after arrested and sentenced to 2 months prison time. Her situation now desperate, Luisa had no choice but to sell her only remaining home, the Palais Rose. In December of 1932, Luisa's personal possessions were auctioned off at the Palais Rose. Surviving records give us a glimpse of the kind of decadent objects Luisa once owned. Auctioned off were shoes made of gold and silver, gilded furniture from Louis XVI, elaborate clothing made of rare material like ostrich feathers, and of course the hundreds of her own portraits that she had commissioned in her prime, including her beloved portrait by Augustus John. How did Luisa feel to see her once glamorous life quickly fade before her very eyes? To see her parents' legacy gone, the many homes she had once designed sold, all of the clothing and luxury items she had once enjoyed taken away, and now the hundreds of portraits of herself that she had commissioned by the best artists of her day, lost to her own financial ruin. In one last-ditch effort, Luisa filed a petition with the French government, pleading that her items auctioned off be returned. Her demands were never answered. Finally accepting that the once glamorous life she enjoyed was officially gone, Luisa came out for one last curtain call. In July of 1935, Luisa attended her very last party. A masquerade, she dressed herself as one of her childhood idols, the Empress Elizabeth of Austria. Dressed in a long black jacket lined with ostrich feathers on its sleeves, a decadent fur collar and headdress made of tiny stars, Luisa made sure she was nothing short of stunning for her last hurrah. Man Ray, who also attended the party, was completely taken by Luisa's marvelous costume. Pulling out his camera, he took what would be one of Luisa's last portraits, and one of the finest photographs of his entire career. In the photograph, we see Luisa standing with her hands on her hips, in front of 2 painted white horses. The horses rear alertly on their hind legs, their hoofs meeting just behind Luisa's head. While the horses seem concerned, their brows anxiously clenched, Luisa remains calm, cool, and collected. She stands confidently with palpable pride. Though she would have to say goodbye to the life she had always known, one of immense privilege and luxury, she tells us with her darting stare that she will walk away from it all with her head held high. We'll continue our story after a brief word from our advertisers. Welcome back, listeners. Now let's dive back in. With her insurmountable debts accumulating in both Italy and France, Luisa decided to relocate to England. At almost 60 years old, Luisa set off for London to establish a new life for herself. There to greet her was painter Augustus John, who warmly welcomed her into the city and helped her make living arrangements. To keep her company, Luisa bought herself 5 Pekingese dogs, who would become her closest companions. There were even times when Luisa would forego her own food so that she could afford to feed her beloved pets. For Luisa's life in London proved to be difficult. By the 1940s, Luisa's financial situation only worsened, and she had barely any money to her name. Already concerningly thin, Luisa now became severely emaciated, her bones protruding from her skin. To hide her aging face, Luisa wore a black veil at all times, her flaming red hair, which she still dyed, spilling out of its sides. On rare occasions, she could be seen walking the streets of London, wrapped in black velvet and leopard skin. As the writer Maurice Drouin remembered of Luisa during this time, when Luisa Casati walked along the streets of London, It took all of the dignity of the English, who were used to not being shocked by anything, not to just gawk at this phantom, dressed as she was in her threadbare ensemble of velvet, leather, and panther trim. At home, she loved to look at herself in a hand mirror while wandering in her memories, which were a bit scrambled. But even though she was penniless, Casati kept her self-esteem. Luisa Casati remains a unique character in my gallery of humankind, a woman filled with self-contemplation, of the romantic construction of her living dream, and an obsession with seeing herself disappear. Drouin's account is one of many that attest to Luisa's resilience despite her severe circumstances. Though impoverished, Luisa never complained about her desperate situation. It seems that the harder her life became, the more she turned to her faith. Whatever money she had was quickly spent on tarot cards and spell books. As Augustus John wrote of Luisa from this time, the loss of her fortune seems only to have confirmed her faith in her star and her conviction of its eventual ascendancy. She meets all her tribulations with unconcern. Though Luisa may not have been worried, it pained John to see Luisa living in such squalor conditions. He eventually set up a bank account for her, which he deposited money into for the rest of her life. Perhaps as reimbursement, John asked Luisa to pose for one last portrait. Painted in 1942, we see a regal Luisa seated on a tall chair, a black cat curled in her lap. At over 60 years old, Luisa has clearly aged from her last portrait by John. Though her face is obscured by a veil, one can see her now sunken eyes, bony cheeks, and strained smile. John, well aware of Luisa's love for the occult, has here transformed Luisa into a matured sorceress, her black cat her familiar. As she sits against a stormy background, Luisa seems to conjure up every last bit of energy she has to cast one last spell upon us. Luisa spent the later years of her life in a top-floor apartment in Piccadilly. Fun fact, Luisa moved into the same apartment that Lady Emma Hamilton had once lived in, something that was not lost on Luisa. She was thrilled to walk the same halls as such an iconic woman of history. It was in this dusty apartment that Luisa hunkered down during the World War II bomb raids over London. Stuck inside, Luisa found company in the many trunks of photographs and mementos from her past. She also found company in the photographer Cecil Beaton, who befriended her during the war. Beaton recalled an unforgettable memory of Luisa from this time in his book, The Glass of Fashion. As Beaton wrote, "One day, during one of the gloomiest winters of the war, I went to call on her to bring her to my home for luncheon, and found her sitting in her room. She was at a table, adding kohl to her darkened eyes, wearing the same black velveteen costume that had been her uniform for the last 10 years. She opened a cupboard and offered me a terrifying glimpse of degradation. Old artificial flowers, broken clocks, bottles of methylated spirit. Today is a terrible day. The devil is in everything," she muttered as she fumbled with keys and locks. When we arrived at my house, she relaxed in the warmth and became enthusiastic and happy as a child. She held forth like an empress, her gestures bold and valiant. Here was a great woman, someone whose character and pluck could overcome all mediocrity and create nobility out of poverty. Beaton's descriptions gives us a sense of both the clutter and squalor in which Luisa lived, as well as her unabating dignity despite the gravest of situations. There are surviving reports that indicate that Luisa was at times heavily intoxicated. It seems on her darkest of days, Luisa turned to alcohol, opium, and on occasion even cocaine to erase her restless thoughts. But Luisa also spent a lot of time with her granddaughter, Moria, during her elder years. Moria would later fondly remember afternoons spent with Luisa, and more specifically, Luisa's wicked sense of humor. She recalled a game Luisa would play with her in restaurants, in which Luisa would randomly pick a person to imitate with shockingly impressive accuracy. She would then imagine their names and the lives they lived, her vivid imagination from childhood clearly just as active in old age. Other times, Luisa would spend her afternoons making collages out of the innumerable photos from her past, pasting them together in large leather album books. We can imagine that collaging memories from her once glamorous past was Luisa's own way of processing the impending end of her life. What Luisa would not have known was that she would actually outlive her own daughter, Christina. In the early 1950s, Christina was diagnosed with terminal breast cancer. Despite treatment, Christina's cancer spread. On March 22, 1953, she succumbed to her disease, passing away at the age of 51. How did Luisa feel to lose her one and only daughter? Was she guilty for her negligence, or did she feel that she had done her very best as a mother? What would she miss most about Christina? While we do not know how Luisa felt about her daughter's passing, we do know that she did not attend Christina's funeral. In the aftermath of Christina's death, Luisa isolated herself from the outside world even more. Now in her mid-70s, she rarely left the confines of her one-room flat. Luisa spent most of her time practicing mediumship and witchcraft. Scattered across the floor were Ouija boards, incense, tarot cards, and crystal balls. She even had a list of all of those who had wronged her, so that she could bestow upon them a revengeful curse. On the list was Cecil Beaton, who had fallen out of Luisa's good graces after taking her photograph without her consent and publishing them in a book. Luisa occasionally hosted the few friends of hers still in good standing, as well as her granddaughter Moria, all of whom she would convince to partake in her occult practices. Even in her old age, and despite her shrunken body, Luisa maintained just as commanding a presence as she had in her prime. By 1957, Luisa retreated more and more into the wells of her own mind. She stopped writing letters, and in some cases even speaking out loud, wanting to communicate solely through mental telepathy. She used telepathy to communicate with birds, who she felt were spirits visiting her. As each one of her beloved Pekingese dogs passed away, she had them taxidermied to keep with her in her apartment. And despite her physical decline, she continued to dress in her signature black satin cloaks and furs and dye her hair a fiery red. But on Saturday, June 1st, 1957, Luisa's end finally came. Suffering from a cerebral hemorrhage, Luisa passed away in her apartment alone, surrounded by her stuffed Pekingese dogs and favorite occult memorabilia. She was 76 years old. Luisa was eventually discovered by a friend who used a spare key when she did not answer the door. Knowing that funeral arrangements would need to be made, her friend dressed Luisa in a leopard print outfit, glued a pair of fake eyelashes on her eyes, and made sure to take one of Luisa's beloved stuffed Pekingese dogs to be buried with her. A mass funeral was held a few days later at the chapel in Harrods. Lying in her signature outfit, with her stuffed furry companion at her side, Luisa continued to shock onlookers even after her death. Those who attended the funeral remembered her looking like a great Gothic figure. Luisa was afterwards buried in the Brompton Cemetery in the district of Kensington in London. Her gravestone, which misspells her first name, is inscribed with the following line from Shakespeare's Antony and Cleopatra: "Age cannot wither her, nor custom stale her infinite variety." As for Luisa's legacy, her infamous Palazzo dei Leoni today houses the Peggy Guggenheim Museum, who purchased the building in 1949. The Palais Rose, which has been restored to its former glory, is now a private residence. and Luisa continues to inspire art, film, and fashion well after her death. Characters based off her have been played by legends like Vivien Leigh in the play La Contessa and Ingrid Bergman in the movie A Matter of Time. Christian Dior released a collection inspired by her in 1998, as did Alexander McQueen in 2007. And in 2021, Lady Gaga dressed as her for a photo shoot for British Vogue. There has also been some recent evaluation of Luisa from a medical standpoint. Doctors today suggest that Luisa may have had Asperger's syndrome, especially evident in her childhood. Like Luisa, those with Asperger's syndrome often have difficulty engaging with and relating to other people. Even in Luisa's adult life, she often avoided eye contact, retreated into silence, and struggled to develop close friendships. As Judith Mackrell wrote, those with Asperger's syndrome function most effectively when they are able to retreat from social interaction into worlds over which they have more control. A significant number of those diagnosed with the condition are gifted as scientists, mathematicians, and musicians. The possibility that Luisa had Asperger's syndrome lends to a deeper understanding of her behavior throughout the course of her life. But Luisa has yet to be given the recognition she deserves. There are few other figures in history who have lived as authentically, inspired as much genius, and had such avant-garde visions of fashion, design, and self-image as Luisa Casati. She set trends and elicited awe everywhere she went. As author Scot Ryersson wrote, the Marchesa Luisa Casati was more than just an eccentric flame from another age. In spite of her many follies, she was a genuine innovator of the arts and an inspiration to creative genius. Her bravery to live against the norm and her unparalleled brilliance as a creative are apparent in every facet of her life. From her homes, which she created into fantastical realms, with clockwork finches, mechanical pumas, and gardens where peacocks and cheetahs roamed free, to her extraordinary parties, masquerades, and balls, which became nocturnal worlds in and of themselves, worlds in which anything felt possible, to the continual creation and recreation of her look and persona, testament to Luisa's lifelong quest to become a living work of art. Luisa transcended herself into a spectacle of endless forms. As the Russian cellist Alexander Bajarnsky once said, she had an artistic temperament, but being unable to express herself in any branch of art, she made an art of herself. In fact, the philosopher Nietzsche once proposed that greatness could only be achieved through turning one's own life into a, quote, unequivocal work of art. And that's inarguably exactly what Luisa did. Her importance as a patron of the arts is also not to be overlooked. Luisa not only supported artists financially, but fearlessly backed their talent when no one else believed in them, showcasing their work and connecting them with high society contacts. She became a savior to the Italian futurists during World War I and an icon to the surrealists, who imitated her preference to exist in dreamlike worlds over reality. And of course, there are her hundreds of commissions to have her own portrait immortalized across the mediums. Luisa was captured on canvas, cast in bronze, and sketched on paper. And these portraits were more than just a way for Luisa to support struggling artists, but for her to preserve a record of her own life and control her self-image. Luisa is still today one of the most represented women in all of the history of art. The independence and self-sufficiency with which Luisa lived her life deserve equal recognition. Luisa lived a life according to her own ambitions, ideals, and wildest imagination. And more than this, she afforded this life without the support or need of a man. She not only had the bravery to dance to the beat of her own drum, consistently pushing past societal convention, but also the financial authority to support herself through it. The fact that that Luisa was able to live her life with such autonomy in a time when women barely had the right to vote was completely unheard of and would be impressive even by today's standards. Of course, Luisa was not without her dark side, and there was much about her that was problematic. She could at times be selfish, egocentric, and cruel. Her insatiable need to reinvent herself and outdo her latest antic came before her own daughter, and she maintained a distanced and cold relationship with Christina her whole life. She often used people as props for her latest performance and then left them cold when they were no longer of use to her. As the cellist Alexander Barjansky recalled, it was her habit to occupy herself entirely with people until she had drawn from them all that was unusual and interesting, and then to drop them entirely. When in later meetings with her, I asked about the friends whom I had seen her with, she would dismiss them with a shrug. Their day was over. To Luisa, the relationship that mattered most to her above her friends, lovers, and even her own family was her relationship with herself. Luisa could also be incredibly childish, often throwing temper tantrums when she didn't get her way. It would not be unreasonable to assume that her emotional intelligence was likely stunted after the consecutive deaths of her parents. From early adolescence, Luisa inevitably harbored the unimaginable pain of losing both her mother and father before the age of 15. The loss of her mother in particular, the only person Luisa felt truly seen by and safe with, undeniably permanently altered the young Luisa. In fact, it could be argued that she spent the rest of her life and fortune desperately trying to recreate the fairy tales her mother had once read to her, and therefore remained connected to her. In doing so, Luisa was able to hide her inner grief and sadness behind her outwardly extravagant lifestyle. It should also be noted that many of Luisa's antics, costumes, and parties were racially insensitive. Her house servants were almost exclusively men of color, predominantly from North Africa, and their work, while perhaps undemanding, was certainly demeaning. Luisa would force them to wear gray-powdered wigs and 18th century costumes. Some were asked to wait on her pets, or worse, her inanimate wax figures. Others expected to form human shields at her parties. And on more than one occasion, Luisa allowed guests to dress in blackface for parties, with themes like Arabian Nights. Luisa's constant quest for the ridiculous inarguably made her blind to her own racism and inexcusably disrespectful behavior. Luisa was, for better or for worse, an undeniable force of nature, and her name and story deserves its place in history. We end today's episode with a quote by fellow social eccentric Quentin Crisp. Many have criticized the extreme aspects of the Marchesa's life, but I believe she had a specific purpose. She wanted to fulfill an ideal, a vision of how she should look and exist. She became a being of her own invention, not one of any particular sex or time or size or shape, and she had total self-confidence. She never doubted herself for one single moment. She knew never to be too predictable. If the public can predict you, it starts to like you. But the Marchesa didn't want to be liked. She wanted to incite. This shrewd lady had a knowing scorn of the world. She presented those who adored her with an image of something they could never hope to be, a being somehow beyond criticism and convention. I hope you have enjoyed ArtMuse's two-part episode on the Marchesa Luisa Casati. I have included images, resources, and suggestions for further reading on the ArtMuse website and Instagram. ArtMuse is produced by Kula Production Company. Today's episode was written by me, your host, Grace Anna. Stay tuned as I continue to share the stories of the women behind some of the world's most important works of art. Until next time, bye for now.